Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into some pretty intense fallout after Donald Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden last week.
Yeah, just a week before the election.
It's got everybody talking, and we're going to figure out why.
It certainly stirred up a lot of conversation. I mean, the speakers that Trump chose and the language that was used at such a public event.
Yeah.
Right before the election. It makes you think about the strategy.
For sure. We've got this Newsweek article that highlights 7 really shocking moments, and some of these are pretty unbelievable. So get ready. We're going to break it all down and really look at what makes these remarks so noteworthy.
I think it's important to really analyze, to go beyond just the words themselves and look at the potential impact, especially on these different groups that are being targeted.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump right in. One of the first things that caught everyone's attention was comedian Tony Hinchcliffe's joke about Puerto Rico, calling it a floating island of garbage. Yeah, and one of Trump's senior advisors actually came out and said that it didn't reflect Trump or the campaign's views, but it still brings up some questions.
It does. I mean, can you really separate the speaker's words from the message of the event as a whole, especially in a charged political environment like this? And, with a significant Puerto Rican population in the U.S., a comment like this could easily be seen as dismissive or even hurtful. I think it's a classic example of distancing.
Distancing.
Yeah. Campaigns often try to use these controversial figures to their advantage, trying to attract those supporters without actually saying they agree with their views.
Yeah.
So they can avoid alienating more moderate voters.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. But Hinchcliffe didn't stop there. He made a bunch of comments about Latinos, saying that they love to make babies and they come inside just like they did to our country.
Wow.
Yeah. It's really disturbing how humor can turn into something so harmful.
It is. And the language he uses it's incredibly loaded.
Yeah.
Tapping into these stereotypes and anxieties about immigration. And it could even be interpreted as a threat. This isn't just crude humor. It's rhetoric that can have consequences.
Yeah, it really feels like he's playing on people's fears and prejudices.
Right. And that's why analyzing this rhetoric is so important. It's about understanding that underlying message and what kind of impact it could have.
Then there was that joke about he pointed to a black man in the audience and talked about carving watermelons with him.
We can't just ignore the historical baggage that comes with watermelons and racist imagery used against black people.
Yeah.
Even if it's framed as a joke. It still perpetuates those harmful stereotypes, and it normalizes prejudice. And these sorts of jokes often rely on dehumanizing language.
Dehumanizing language? I've been hearing that a lot lately. What does that even mean?
It means using language that strips away someone's humanity. Making it easier to justify attacking them, like comparing your opponents to animals or insects. It's dangerous, because it creates this us versus them mentality.
So like using that watermelon imagery, that could be seen as dehumanizing.
Absolutely. It invokes such a loaded and historically charged image, reducing an entire group of people to this harmful stereotype. It's not just a harmless joke, it reinforces a really long history of prejudice.
That's a good point. It seems like there's a pattern emerging here with Hinchcliffe's humor, but then things took an even darker turn with the attacks on Kamala Harris.
Yeah. There were 2 that really stood out. One speaker called her the Antichrist, and then another speaker, businessman Grant Cardone, called her a fake with pimp handlers. I mean, that's a serious escalation in rhetoric.
Wow. It's incredible. Why do you think they're using such extreme language?
Maybe it's an attempt to dehumanize the people they see as their opponents, to make them seem so different and dangerous that any attack against them is justified. It creates this emotionally charged atmosphere that makes it really difficult for people to actually think critically.
Yeah, it sets a very specific tone for the whole rally. Then there's this really strange moment where radio host Sid Rosenberg actually calls the event a Nazi rally, but then also said that Trump is loved in Israel. I mean, talk about mixed messages.
It is a strange juxtaposition. It's hard to know exactly what he meant by it, but it could be an attempt at irony or provocation. It's definitely the kind of statement that people are going to interpret in many different ways, depending on their own viewpoints.
Yeah, it's really confusing. And Rosenberg also had some really vulgar things to say about Hillary Clinton, calling her a sick son of a bee.
Bringing us back to the 2016 election and just the lingering animosity towards Clinton, whether this type of language belongs in political discourse is a question worth asking.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Maybe we should step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. What are your thoughts on the tone and message of this rally overall?
What really stands out to me is the constant use of dehumanizing language, targeting specific groups, and just this escalation of the rhetoric to a really alarming level.
And how do you think this event might influence the election? Especially considering it happens so close to voting day.
It's hard to say for sure what the impact will be, but it definitely raises concerns about polarization and division. I mean, these remarks were aimed at key voting blocs, Latinos, Black voters, and it could either alienate them or it could actually motivate them to vote against Trump.
Yeah, and this feels like it's a reflection of the state of political discourse in the U.S. right now.
Definitely. This rally could be a sign of even further erosion of civility and respectful dialogue in politics. It's concerning that the focus is on inflammatory language and personal attacks, instead of engaging with policy and the issues that really matter.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a point where shock value and outrage have become normal in political campaigns. But what does that mean for democracy?
That is the question we all need to be asking. When this level of anger becomes normal, it makes it harder to have real conversations about the things that really matter. It's important to remember this isn't like an isolated incident. We've seen this kind of rhetoric from Trump and his supporters before.
Yeah, that's true. His campaign has often used this inflammatory language, personal attacks. Some argue it's a strategy, to appeal to a specific group of voters.
Right. It's about tapping into those feelings of fear and resentment and division. It might energize his base, but it also risks alienating more moderate voters and just making the polarization in this country even worse.
So bringing it back to this rally, do you think these shocking remarks could actually hurt Trump?
It's definitely possible. I mean, alienating Latino and Black voters with offensive language could have a big impact on the election results, especially in those swing states.
But then there's that saying, all press is good press, right? Could this controversy actually help Trump in some way?
Yeah, there's an argument that this kind of thing keeps him in the headlines, reinforces his image as this outsider, the one who challenges the establishment. But the question is, at what cost? Normalizing this kind of rhetoric, it contributes to a climate of intolerance. It gives a platform to hate speech.
That's a scary thought. It's interesting that the Newsweek article also mentions that Trump is really popular in Israel. How do you reconcile that with one of his supporters calling the rally a Nazi rally?
It just shows the political views. They're rarely simple. Supporting a particular leader or ideology doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with everything they say or do, or everything their supporters do.
So even within Trump's own base, we're seeing these really conflicting narratives.
Exactly. And that complexity is why it's so important to think critically, to avoid these simplistic interpretations. We can't just accept sound bites and surface-level analysis. We have to go deeper. Look at the context. Think about motivations and consequences of what's being said and done.
That's something our listeners should really keep in mind. What does all of this mean for them? How should they approach this election, given how intense things are?
It means being informed, being discerning, and actively engaged. Don't just absorb information passively. Question it. Consider the sources, the agendas, and any potential biases.
We need to be critical thinkers, especially now.
Exactly. And we need to be open to those tough conversations with people who see things differently. It's easy to stay in our own echo chambers, to only hear the opinions that confirm our own beliefs. But to really have a dialogue, the kind that moves us forward, that takes listening, empathy, and a willingness to consider other perspectives, even when they challenge our own.
That's powerful. So as we go into these last few days before the election, let's all try to be a little more thoughtful, a little more informed, and definitely more engaged as citizens. This deep dive has been really something. We've seen those shocking remarks, analyzed the potential impact, talked about what this means for political discourse. But, there's one thing that I keep thinking about. Well, we've really focused on the negative consequences of all this rhetoric. Could there be any, unintended positive outcomes? Could this end up backfiring in a way that's good for democracy?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's possible that these very obvious displays of prejudice could actually energize the opposition. It might actually motivate people to get more involved in the political process.
So it could backfire by making people more engaged with democracy.
Yeah, exactly. When people are faced with these ideas that they find so awful, it can cause outrage, a real desire to push back against those views. It could lead to more people voting, more activism, and a renewed focus on promoting tolerance and understanding.
Okay, that's a more hopeful way to look at it. It's a reminder that even when things seem really bad, there's always potential for positive change.
And it reminds us that we have a choice. We can't just sit back and watch this happen. We have to be involved in shaping the future.
So for our listeners, as we head into this election and beyond? What's the one thing you want them to take away from all of this?
Be critical, be engaged, and stay hopeful. We have the power to reject hate, to amplify the voices of reason, and to build a society that's more inclusive and more just for everyone.
Well said. That's all the time we have for this deep dive, folks. But stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. We'll catch you next time.